The memory of the alley didn't fade like a dream, it clung like the ghost of that last, freezing rain, seeping into my bones every morning I woke in my too-soft bed. 2 years. I had 2 years before the carefully orchestrated tragedy of my first life would begin its final act. This time, the heiress's finery felt not like privilege, but like a target painted on my back. So, I became a ghost in my own home. I sold my mother's sapphire pendant, the one she'd whispered was for a rainy day, to a discreet jeweler in a different city. I practiced looking pale and faint until my uncle's hawk-like gaze would slide away in irritated dismissal. And I remembered a name, spoken once by a tired maid longing for home, Humbert's Glen. A place, she'd sighed, where the air was sweet and nobody cared about your surname. The village was a postcard of tranquility, all cobblestones and chimneys smoking against a green hill. It made my city-sharp nerves feel raw and exposed. For a week, I observed from the corner of the tea shop. I needed a man. Not a romantic prospect, the very idea was a laughable vulnerability, but a tool. One who was kind enough to agree to a mad scheme, simple enough not to ask the wrong questions, and bland enough to be forgettable. I found him at the weekly market. He was tall, but he stooped slightly, as if to make himself less imposing. His hands, carefully placing apples into an old woman's basket, were broad and capable, etched with soil and what looked like old scars. But it was his face that held my attention. Not handsome in the polished, sharp way of the men I knew, but calm. His eyes, the color of settled earth, watched the bustling crowd with a patient stillness that felt like an anchor in my storm-tossed mind. Henry. The baker's boy had called him Henry. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs as I followed him after his errands, away from the square and down a quieter lane. This was it. The point of no return. Mr. Henry? He turned, and those calm eyes settled on me. There was no leer, no calculation of my dress's quality, just open, mild curiosity. Can I help you, miss? The words I'd rehearsed for nights tumbled out in a blunt, icy stream. I need to disappear. I can pay. I propose a marriage in name only. I will be a diligent partner in all visible ways, and in return, I ask for shelter and your public claim as my husband. After 1 year, I will leave, and you will be a wealthier man. The silence that followed was absolute. I braced for laughter, for outrage, for a demand for explanations. Instead, he simply studied me. His gaze didn't feel invasive, it felt, assessing, like he was reading the fear etched in the tight line of my shoulders, the desperation I'd mistaken for steel. Finally, he spoke, his voice as soft and steady as a summer stream. I don't need your money, miss. He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath with me. But I could use help around the farm. The weeds are winning the war in the kitchen garden, and a smart pair of hands would be a welcome relief. A faint, almost shy smile touched his lips. And everyone deserves to feel safe. The offer stands, but as a real partnership. No payments. It was the last thing I expected. Not a negotiation, but a counteroffer of breathtaking simplicity. Safety. He'd said the word as if it were a tangible thing he could offer, like a loaf of bread. My carefully constructed speech crumbled. All I could do was nod, a stiff, jerky motion. Ruby, I whispered, giving him the name I'd chosen for this new life. It tasted of something rough and real. Henry, he replied, as if we were just meeting. Well, Ruby. Let's go home. Home. The word echoed strangely in the hollowed-out place inside me. The wedding was a quiet, dusty affair in the village chapel. My something borrowed was a sprig of lavender from the vicar's wife. When the old pastor pronounced us man and wife and said, "You may kiss the bride," I froze, my whole body locking into a statue of dread. This was the part where the mask of civility would crack, where demands would begin. Henry didn't move toward my lips. Instead, he took my hand, his own warm and slightly calloused. He bowed his head, and I felt the soft press of his mouth against my knuckles. It was a shock, a jolt of something that wasn't fear. It was reverence. The kiss lingered, a sealed promise, before he straightened and met my wide eyes. A promise of respect, he murmured, the sound just for me. The warmth of his lips seemed to brand my skin. The tension uncoiled slightly, only to wind itself tighter on the cart ride to his farm. The forest grew thicker, the shadows longer. This is where it happens, a voice inside me shrieked. In the isolation, where no one can hear you. And then, as if my fear had summoned them, they stepped onto the path. 2 men with hard eyes and harder smiles. Bandits. My breath hitched, the alleyway rushing back, the cold, the metallic scent, the blinding pain. Well, what have we here? A sweet little newlywed pair, the larger one sneered, his gaze raking over me. Before the paralyzing terror could fully claim me, I heard a sigh. A weary, almost disappointed sound from beside me. Henry's gentle demeanor didn't exactly fall away, but it settled. Like a still pond revealing its stony bed. "Gentlemen," Henry said, his voice still quiet, but it now carried a strange, clear weight. "It's my wedding day. Please don't." The bandits laughed. The sound was cut short. What happened next was a blur of efficiency so profound it was more unsettling than any dramatic fight. Henry moved, and it was less like a man brawling and more like a natural event, a sudden gust of wind, a tree branch falling. There was a dull thud, a sharp gasp, the clatter of a knife on stone. I barely saw his hands move. One moment the men were threatening, the next they were slumped against each other, unconscious, propped against a gnarled oak. Henry stood over them, not even out of breath. He picked up their fallen knives, examined the blades with a critical frown, and tossed them into the undergrowth. Then, with methodical care, he used their own belts to secure them to the tree trunk. He patted the larger one's shoulder almost apologetically. He turned back to me. The gentle smile was back, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the woods. "The sheriff will collect them later," he said, as if commenting on the weather. He climbed back onto the cart seat, took the reins, and glanced at my frozen form. I did warn them. We rode the rest of the way in silence. The farmhouse, when it appeared, was a picture of rustic charm, stone and timber, with a lush garden. But my eyes, newly trained by terror, saw other things. The placement of the windows, strategic, offering clear lines of sight. The heavy oak door, banded with iron that looked older and sturdier than any farm needed. He showed me inside, to a clean, warm kitchen that smelled of herbs and baked bread. "This is yours," he said, gesturing to the main bedroom. "I'll take the loft. It's warmer up there anyway." The kindness was a knot in my throat. I just nodded, unable to speak. That night, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of sunshine and lavender, I listened to the sounds of the house. The creak of settling wood. The sigh of the wind. And from below, the soft, rhythmic shush-shush of a blade against wood. Henry was whittling. The sound was oddly soothing, yet it kept me awake. What kind of farmer moved like that? Disarmed men with the casual grace of shoeing chickens? Driven by a fear deeper than curiosity, I slipped from bed and peered down the staircase. He sat by the dying fire, a halo of wood shavings around his boots. His face, illuminated by the embers, was not the soft, open face of the market or the chapel. It was focused, intent, etched with a quiet intensity that made him look like a stranger. In his hands was a block of pale wood, and taking shape under his careful knife wasn't a toy animal or a spoon. It was the long, smooth grip of a dagger, the outline of a guard beginning to curve. He paused, held it up to the firelight to check its balance, and his eyes, reflecting the glow, held the flat, assessing look of a man who knew exactly how such a tool was used. I crept back to bed, the cold seeping back into my veins, different from the cold of the alley. This was the chill of the unknown. I had run from wolves and found sanctuary with a man who carved weapons by the fire and sighed at bandits. My safe, simple farmer was a lie. The question now, thumping in time with my heart, was what kind of man had I truly married? The dagger handle, pale and unfinished, became a ghost in every corner of the farmhouse. I saw its shape in the curve of a spoon, the handle of the water pump, the gnarl of an apple branch. Henry remained exactly as he had been that first day, patient, gentle, offering me a quiet companionship that felt like a warm blanket I was too afraid to pull around myself. That was the true tension, the unbearable contrast between the man who sang off-key to his tomato plants and the man who had moved with silent, violent precision. I threw myself into the work of the farm. The kitchen garden was indeed a battlefield of rampant weeds and defiant thistles. My hands, once soft and meant for embroidery needles and piano keys, grew blistered and then calloused. There was a brutal honesty in the work, in the ache of muscles and the satisfaction of a straight, clean row of carrots. Henry taught me, his instructions always clear, his praise quiet and specific. "Your trench for the peas is excellent, deep and even. They'll root well." One afternoon, seeking twine in his cluttered workshop, I moved a stack of seed catalogs. Beneath them was a ledger. But the columns weren't for bushels or shillings. They were dates, initials, and strings of seemingly random numbers: G12. M45 722. A cold trickle, familiar and slick, traced down my spine. This wasn't a farmer's record. It was a code. I snapped the book shut, my heart hammering. When I placed it back, my hands were steady. A survival skill: never let the predator see your fear. The romance, stupidly, insistently, bloomed in the cracks of my suspicion. It was in the mug of tea that appeared beside me on the porch steps at the exact moment I felt a chill. It was in the way he'd brush his thumb, absent-mindedly, over a newly formed callus on my palm, his brow furrowed as if concerned for the well-being of my skin. It was corny and tender, and it disarmed me more effectively than any bandit ever could. The pivotal moment came in the kitchen. He was teaching me to make his bread. I was kneading, my frustration growing with the stubborn dough. "You're fighting it," he said softly, coming to stand behind me. He covered my flour-dusted hands with his own. "Don't force it. Feel it. Guide it. Like this." His hands moved, a firm, gentle pressure that was both directive and encompassing. The heat of him at my back, the sure movement of our hands together, stole the air from my lungs. It felt more intimate than any ballroom waltz. "Why?" The word escaped me, a desperate, broken sound. I stared at our joined hands, white with flour. "Why are you so kind to me? What do you want?" His hands stilled. He was silent for so long I could hear the fire crackle and the dough's faint sigh as it settled. He slowly released my hands and turned me to face him. His earthy eyes were deep with a sorrow that seemed ancient. "I want to knead bread on a Tuesday," he said finally, his voice rough. "I want to see if the robins come back to the same nest. I want quiet, Ruby. The kind of quiet you only get when you've stopped listening for screams." He reached out and, with infinite care, wiped a smudge of flour from my cheekbone. The gesture was his answer. He saw my screams, even the silent ones from a life he couldn't know about. "I want the peace I see you trying so hard to build here. That's all." I believed him. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The peace shattered a week later. The man who arrived was no rough bandit. He wore a city-cut coat and a smile as polished and cold as a river stone. He introduced himself as a tax assessor for the county, but his eyes didn't survey the property, they dissected me. Henry became a masterpiece of rural simplicity. He slouched, his dialect thickened, and he launched into an excruciatingly detailed monologue about the nitrogen-fixing properties of clover versus vetch. He offered the man a slice of pie so sweet it made my teeth ache. "It's the missus's recipe," he said, beaming at me with dopey pride. The agent left, visibly frustrated, but the poison was sown. The look he'd given me, a flicker of recognition, of triumph, was a brand. That night, a storm raged. The wind howled like the ghosts of my past, and the fear became a living thing in my throat. I found Henry in the main room, staring into the fire, his profile sharp and tense. The gentle farmer was gone again. "They found me." My voice was a thread in the din of the storm. He didn't look away from the flames. "They did." "Who are you?" The question was a plea this time. He turned then, and the raw honesty on his face was more disquieting than any secret. "I was a man who built walls of secrets to protect a rotten kingdom," he said. "I realized I was shoring up decay, not defending anything worth saving. So I walked away. Everything I was, everything I knew, I buried it here. In this soil." He took a step toward me. "I promised you safety, Ruby. That promise is the truest thing I've ever built." The dam within me broke. The story of my first life, the gilded cage, the uncle's cold eyes, the fiancé's betrayal, the alley's consuming cold and the final, shocking pain, poured out of me in a torrent of tears and fragmented, aching confession. I told him of dying alone, unknown, unloved. Of the sheer waste of it. He didn't flinch. He didn't scoff. He listened, a silent fortress in the storm. When I finished, spent and shaking, he simply opened his arms. It wasn't a demand, just an offer. I fell into them. He held me as I shattered, his chin resting on the top of my head, his hands rubbing slow circles on my back. "You are not alone in this farmhouse," he murmured into my hair, repeating his early words with a new, solemn weight. "Not anymore." The morning dawned clear and washed clean. A fragile, hopeful thing trembled in my chest. I decided to trust. To clean not just my own spaces, but his workshop, a gesture of belonging. I was dusting the shelf above his workbench when my cloth caught on a splinter. A small panel at the back of the shelf shifted. Hard in my throat, I pried it open. Inside wasn't a weapon. It was a small, velvet pouch. I poured its contents into my palm. A heavy metal, gold and enamel, gleamed in a shaft of sunlight. It bore the crest of the royal shadows, the kingdom's most feared and secretive order. Beneath it was a miniature portrait on ivory. A younger Henry, his eyes not calm earth, but glacial steel, stared back at me from a uniform of stark black. The proof was cold in my hand. Not a farmer. A spymaster. A ghost, like me. The floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, the metal clutched to my chest like a shield. Henry stood in the doorway, his face pale. He saw the open panel, the portrait in my other hand. His shoulders slumped, not in guilt, but in a profound resignation. Before he could speak, the window pane beside my head exploded. A arrow shaft, fletched with raven feathers, quivered in the wooden wall where my face had been a second before. A voice, thin and venomous, sliced through from the woods beyond. Lord Stirling sends his regards, my lady. He'll have that medallion back. Traitor. The last word wasn't for me. Henry's eyes met mine. In them, I saw the death of our quiet peace, and the furious, terrifying birth of something else. The past hadn't just found us. It had come with a bow drawn, and it was aiming for both of our hearts. The arrow's fletching vibrated with a deadly hum an inch from my ear. In the frozen splinter of time that followed, I saw two men, the Henry before me, his face wiped clean of all its gentle patience, and the Henry in the miniature portrait, the one of glacial steel. They snapped together into one terrifying, focused reality. Down, he said. Not a shout. A command, low and absolute, that brooked no argument. It wasn't the voice of my farmer. It was the voice of the man who had sighed at bandits. He moved, a shadow blurring across the room. I didn't go down. I couldn't. My body was lead, my eyes fixed on him as he yanked the arrow from the wall, snapped it in two without seeming effort, and was at the window in a crouch, assessing the tree line. Ruby, his voice cut through my paralysis. Root cellar. Now. Don't come out until I come for you. This time, I obeyed. I scrambled for the hatch in the kitchen floor, the metal still a cold, hard knot in my fist. As I lowered myself into the dark, earthy-smelling space, I saw him pick up the fire poker from the hearth. It looked like a sword in his hand. The last thing I saw was his eyes finding mine in the gloom, a flash of that fierce, protective sorrow, before he kicked the hatch shut over me. Alone in the dark, I heard it. Not a battle. Something worse. A silence, punctuated by brief, brutal sounds, a sharp cry cut short, a thud against the side of the house, a guttural curse that ended in a strangled gurgle. Then, a longer, heavier silence. My heart beat against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited for the hatch to open, for Stirling's leering face to appear. Instead, I heard the familiar, heavy tread of Henry's boots. The hatch lifted, and daylight flooded in, framing him. He was breathing deeply, a sheen of sweat on his brow, and a dark, angry bruise was blossoming along his jawline. In his hand, he held not the poker, but three long, wicked-looking hunting knives. It's handled, he said, his voice returning to its normal register, though edged with fatigue. He saw my wide-eyed stare at the knives. Theirs, not mine. I'll add them to the collection in the barn. He helped me out. My legs were water. The farmyard was empty, eerily peaceful. The sheriff? I managed. We'll find them tied up at the crossroad, with a very detailed note about attempted murder and tax fraud, he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at the metal I still clutched. We need to talk. Over strong, sweet tea at our kitchen table, the domesticity a surreal contrast to the violence minutes before, he told me everything. He spoke not as a penitent, but as a historian of his own life. The royal shadows, the corruption festering at its core, his mentor's betrayal for profit and power. How the men I feared, my uncle, Stirling, were just gilded rats in the same rotten parliament. The metal was a key, he explained, to a cache of evidence he'd hidden, proof of treason that could topple not just my personal monsters, but the entire poisonous network. I stole it, faked my death, and came here to forget, he finished, his gaze on the steam rising from his cup. To knead bread. To watch robins. But they never stopped looking for it. And now they've seen you with me. A strange calm settled over me. The running was over. The hiding was over. The fear, which had been a cold stone in my belly for 2 lifetimes, melted into something else, a white-hot coal of anger. Then we stop running, I said. My voice didn't shake. He looked up, surprised. We have the same enemies. I know their world, their greed, their social rituals. You have, I gestured vaguely at him, at the barn where he deposited troublesome people, your particular set of skills. Let's finish it. Together. The plan we forged over the next days was a patchwork of my memory and his craft. I would be the bait, not as a frightened heiress, but as a sharp, slightly mysterious widow with capital to invest, drawn back to the city by rumors of a lucrative royal timber contract. Henry would be my quiet, devoted manservant, always in the background. We would dangle the possibility of the metal's location as a trade for the contract, drawing my uncle and Sterling into a private meeting. Returning to the city was like stepping into a painted backdrop of a forgotten play. The smells, the sounds, the calculating glances, they were all the same, but I was not. I had calluses and a calmness that came from weeding gardens and being protected by a man with a fire poker. The meeting was set in a private club room, all dark wood and velvet. My uncle looked older, his eyes like chips of flint. Sterling was as polished and soulless as ever. When I entered, their surprise was a palpable, greasy thing in the air. Niece, my uncle said, the word a threat. Gentlemen, I replied, my tone that of a businesswoman. I spoke of forests and tariffs, watching Sterling's greed ignite. Then, quietly, I mentioned a token from my late husband, a gold trinket from his shadowy past that certain powerful men might pay a fortune to retrieve. The air changed. Their masks slipped. Just as my uncle leaned forward, his voice a venomous whisper, "You foolish girl, you've only brought it back to where it belongs." The door opened. Henry entered. But he didn't slouch. He didn't look at the floor. He stood like the soldier he was, and beside him was a stern-faced man in the uniform of the true royal guard, accompanied by 4 armed soldiers. "I believe," Henry said, his voice filling the room with its new, quiet authority, "these gentlemen were just confessing to conspiracy and treason. The evidence, including the ledger detailing your plots and the murders you commissioned, is with the Chancellor as we speak." The arrest was swift. The sputtering, purple-faced rage of my uncle, the dawning horror on Sterling's face, it was not the sweet revenge I'd imagined. It was just closure. A door slamming shut on a tomb. Later, back at the farm, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of hiding, but of aftermath. The 1-year mark of our bargain arrived, unspoken but felt in the autumn air. Henry took me on a picnic to the apple orchard. The trees were heavy with fruit, the light dappled and golden. He was nervous, his big hands fumbling with the basket clasp. "The bargain is fulfilled," he began, not meeting my eye. "You are safe. You are free. Your name is cleared, your fortune restored. You can go anywhere in the world." He paused, swallowing hard. "But the farm, it's too quiet without the sound of you arguing with the weeds. The kitchen is too big without you burning the stew." Finally, he looked at me, and his eyes held everything, the farmer, the soldier, the man who kissed my hand. "I am too quiet without you, Ruby. The partnership? I'd like to make it real. In every way." Tears blurred the golden light. I thought of the alley, and the cold, and the loneliness that had been my first end. I thought of flower-dusted hands, and shared silences, and a protection that asked for nothing in return. "The proposal had a flaw," I said, my voice thick. He flinched, just slightly. I reached for his hand, the one that held weapons and planted seeds with equal care. It stipulated a diligent partner in all visible ways. I laced my fingers through his. "I find I want to be a partner in all the invisible ones, too. The scared ones. The trusting ones. The ones that last longer than a year." The relief that broke over his face was the sunrise after a lifelong night. He pulled me to him, and our first real kiss was there, under the apple boughs. It tasted of sunshine, and hope, and a future we had built ourselves, from the roots up. The royal metal, buffed to a soft shine, sits on the windowsill in the kitchen. It holds down a list titled, "Spring Planting, Rotate Squash and Beans." Henry says it's the best paperweight he's ever had. I am at the counter, flour to my elbows, battling a pie crust. My latest venture, funding a network of shelters for women who need to disappear, requires ledgers of my own, but they are filled with hope, not codes. Henry comes in from the yard, the smell of fresh earth and autumn air clinging to him. He wraps his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder, observing my culinary struggle. The sheriff dropped by, he murmurs, his lips against my neck. More travelers on the western road. Had to have a firm chat about the benefits of honest work. I laugh, swatting at him with a flowery hand. You are incorrigible. He turns me in his arms, his eyes soft, his smile the one I saw that first day in the market, the one that promised safety. He kisses my flower-dusted cheek, then my lips, sweet and slow. But I'm yours, he says. And in his eyes, I see it all, the shadow, the soldier, the farmer. All of him, home at last. Mine. Outside, the rooster crows, the leaves rustle, and the roots of our life grow deep and strong in the quiet, fertile soil we chose together.